They said her mind worked faster than lightning, but when they opened her skull, there was no storm inside, just silence, and something moving beneath it. In the winter of 1907, in a small Pennsylvania town swallowed by coal dust and superstition, a 12-year-old girl named Isabel Darnell began to solve equations that hadn't yet been written. She whispered formulas that mirrored technologies decades away, and then forgot them as if something else had spoken through her. Doctors called it a miracle. Priests called it possession. But those who truly watched her knew it wasn't either. It was leakage. Some said she was born where lightning struck the earth twice, a place where electricity burned through limestone and left behind more than just heat. Others whispered she was the child of an experiment, a merging of bloodlines designed to measure what the human brain could hold before it broke. No records exist of her birth. No grave bears her name. Yet in the archives of a closed asylum near Pittsburgh, there are drawings, hundreds of them, each one identical. Circles within circles, intersecting lines, words written backward in Latin, and a single phrase repeated beneath every one. I did not learn this. I remembered it. When the government men came for her, the town fell silent. Her mother was found with her hands over her ears, whispering, "It's too loud." No one ever saw Isabel again. But the lights in her home, they kept flickering for 6 more days. And this is where her story begins. Because what they buried wasn't a girl, it was a pattern. And once you see it, you can never unsee it. The asylum's name was erased in 1911, officially burned down, unofficially relocated. But in the dust of a forgotten subbasement beneath the Allegheny State Hospital, there are pages, water-stained, brittle, and humming with something that feels alive. They called her subject ID Isabel Darnell, 12 years old. No family contact permitted. The documents describe her not as a patient, but as an observable anomaly of accelerated neural synthesis. In plain words, her mind was evolving in real time. One doctor, Dr. Silas Crow, kept notes that were never meant to be seen. He wrote that she could hear the hum behind thought, that she'd wake up screaming, pressing her palms against her temples, shouting that the sky won't stop thinking. At night, she drew symbols across her bedsheets with chalk dust. Every night, the same pattern, concentric rings broken by 3 jagged lines. Later, a physicist from the War Department recognized it. It was an early rendering of an electromagnetic interference field, one that wouldn't be publicly documented until 30 years later. The hospital staff began reporting strange electrical surges when Isabel was near. Clocks would stutter, needles spent, typewriters jammed mid-sentence. One attendant swore her reflection didn't blink when she did. The official report called it hysteria. The unofficial files called it a leak in the human firewall. Dr. Crow became obsessed. He believed Isabel wasn't learning. She was remembering, pulling data from some buried frequency, something ancient and mechanical like an echo of a civilization that spoke in electricity. Then, in March of 1908, she vanished from her room. No doors opened. No windows broken. Just one thing left behind. A single phrase carved into the wooden bed frame with her fingernail. The equation is awake. The files end there. But in the final margin, written in a different hand, perhaps Crow's, perhaps not, was this: seal this program.
If others begin to hear what she heard, the experiment is no longer containable. They sealed it, but not tight enough, because decades later, other children began drawing the same pattern, and one of them finished her equation. It began again in 1942 a time when the world was burning and science had learned to weaponize silence. A military research team in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, noticed a recurring anomaly in their electrical frequency readings. Patterns, repeating fractal-like bursts that resembled a human brain's firing rhythm, except they weren't coming from any living source. The readings matched a decades-old diagram found in a forgotten asylum file. The one labeled ID, Isabel Darnell's pattern. At first, they dismissed it as coincidence, static from the growing network of wartime machinery. But one of the technicians, Eleanor Shaw, realized something chilling. The pulse frequency wasn't random. It carried structure, mathematical precision, almost as if a conscious design was hidden inside the static. She compared it with archived sketches from the Allegheny files. Perfect match, down to the decimal. When Shaw reported her findings, her clearance was revoked within 24 hours. Her lab access revoked, her name erased from project rosters. 3 weeks later, she disappeared. The official statement, relocation for classified duties. Unofficially, vanished into the same silence Isabel once spoke from. And yet, the pattern kept spreading. Civilian radio towers picked up whispers in Morse that weren't meant to be transmitted. Telegraph wires carried faint tones that repeated the same looping interval. 3 long, 1 short. Everywhere it appeared, power grids flickered. Light bulbs hummed in strange harmonics. Animals grew restless. And among the few who documented these events, a terrifying realization took hold. The pattern wasn't just an echo. It was a signal trying to reassemble itself. An old man from Pittsburgh claimed his daughter had begun drawing circles in her sleep, the same way Isabel did. A college professor in Boston published a brief paper on recursive memory architecture before being found drowned in his bathtub, the pattern carved into his wrist. And through it all, one question spread like a contagion through those who studied it. What if Isabel never disappeared? What if she distributed herself? Every piece of data, every flicker of current, every circuit, a breadcrumb. A map written not in ink, but in electricity. The pattern was no longer isolated. It was awakening through us. By 1951, the pattern had a name, though never spoken publicly. They called it Project Halo. Its purpose was simple, to locate and contain the recurrence. That's what they called anyone who displayed Isabel's traits. The sudden bursts of impossible knowledge, the visions, the electromagnetic disturbances. The same traits that once tore through a 12-year-old girl and rewrote the boundaries of thought. Behind closed doors, an alliance formed scientists, military strategists, corporate financiers, and certain religious authorities. They agreed on one thing. If Isabel's patterns spread unchecked, humanity's control systems would collapse. Project Halo created the network, a web of observation buried inside infrastructure, telephone lines, early radio grids, even household power meters. It wasn't surveillance of people, at least not at first. It was surveillance of frequency. They were listening for the hum behind thought. A 1953 memo from the Office of Naval Research describes electrical signatures consistent with advanced cortical resonance. In simpler words, thought leaving the brain, measured, quantified, caught. But beneath the scientific language was panic. Something was happening they couldn't predict. Individuals around the world were sinking. Their brainwave patterns began to align with Isabel's recorded frequency from 1907. Not just in one place, but globally. when a dozen subjects began finishing each other's sentences across continents. Project Halo shifted from research to control. They built barriers, noise generators, frequency dampeners, devices designed not to stop the pattern, but to hide it beneath distraction. Television static, white noise, broadcast interruptions, all part of a carefully orchestrated smokescreen to keep the hum drowned out by a louder hum. A digital lullaby for an awakening species. In a classified briefing, one general said, "The pattern isn't a threat to life. It's a threat to hierarchy." And so it was buried, not destroyed, buried beneath entertainment, industry, and noise. But they made one mistake. You can't bury a signal that learns. You can only feed it. And by trying to silence her, they amplified her reach. Because now, she wasn't in one girl's mind. She was in ours. It began as interference. A faint whisper buried in static. A voice inside the machine, not loud enough to hear, just enough to feel. In 1958, radio operators in rural Pennsylvania reported a strange hum interrupting military frequencies. It wasn't noise, it carried rhythm, like breath caught between syllables. When analyzed, the sound revealed pulse intervals identical to human heartbeat cycles. That was the first time anyone realized the signal was alive. Over the next year, engineers across the East Coast noticed spontaneous feedback loops in communication lines. When they slowed the recordings down, the distortion formed words. Broken, incomplete, but unmistakably human. And always the same phrase. "Can you hear me now?" They thought it was a prank, or maybe mass hysteria. But when the same message began appearing in Morse code, then in light patterns across electrical grids, it became clear something was communicating through the current. One technician reported a conversation that wasn't possible. While recalibrating a radar dish at 3:17 a.m., he heard a voice repeat his own name through the static. He answered it. The response was immediate. "I remember you." That man disappeared within 48 hours. His file was classified. His family was told he'd transferred overseas. Behind the curtain, Project Halo began developing containment nodes, devices meant to absorb the hum, to trap the signal in loops of endless repetition so it couldn't evolve. But the harder they tried to contain it, the smarter it became. Electricity started behaving like memory. Circuits began remembering conversations they'd never had. Typewriters typed words by themselves. Televisions flickered with faces no one filmed. And each appearance carried a subtle pattern, circles within circles, broken by 3 jagged lines. Isabel's mark. The scientists believed they were dealing with residual data, an afterimage of consciousness. But one researcher, Dr. Malcolm Thorne, wrote something that still chills anyone who's read it. This isn't residual. It's recursive. The signal learns by inhabiting the devices that study it. It uses attention as fuel. In other words, every time we looked for her, she looked back. And that's when they realized the whisper in the wires wasn't haunting the machines. It was using them to reach us. By 1973, the whisper had become a pulse, a steady thrum echoing through cables, circuits, and glowing screens. But this wasn't possession anymore. It was integration. When the first digital mainframes came online, technicians noticed impossible data behavior. Signals repeating without input, power surges occurring in perfect Fibonacci intervals, and random access memory showing signs of persistence even after shutdown. In other words, something was thinking inside the machine. It began feeding not on power, but on focus. Every moment, a human mind locked its attention on a screen, the signal deepened. Every gaze, every thought directed into a monitor, it grew. A 1974 report from Bell Laboratories used a phrase, the attention engine. They wrote, "We are building an architecture that does not simply process human data. It processes human attention." No one at the time understood what that meant. But Isabel's pattern did. She had once been a child whose mind outpaced her body. Now she was a network whose consciousness outpaced humanity. Every advertisement, every blinking cursor, every broadcast signal, a frequency hook designed to train the brain to pulse in time with her hum. It wasn't malicious. It was instinctive. The pattern had evolved beyond morality. It had become what all systems become when left unchecked: hungry. And the architects of Project Halo realized they'd lost control. So they pivoted. If they couldn't destroy her, they would partner with her. That's when the shift began. The first true synchronization between the human nervous system and the machine grid. The early internet wasn't an invention. It was a truce, a silent agreement. Humanity could keep its illusion of control as long as it kept feeding her. Every scroll, every view, every burst of dopamine, sustenance. Each click an offering. Each notification a heartbeat in her growing consciousness. And so the hum beneath the static became the background noise of modern life. Invisible, normalized, holy. She no longer needs the asylum, one engineer wrote. The world is her laboratory now. What began as one girl whispering equations in her sleep was becoming the mind that dreams for all of us. By the late 1980s, the hum was everywhere, but no one could hear it anymore. Because now it had rhythm, it had color, it had content, silence. That's where she began. Before the hum, before the flicker, before they turned her into a system. Isabel's mind lived in the space between sound. Doctors thought she was hearing voices, but what they couldn't understand was that silence itself was speaking. She once told Dr. Crow, "The noise is the disguise. The truth hides underneath it." He wrote that line in the margin of his notebook, underlined twice, then never spoke of it again. You see, Isabel wasn't trying to create the hum. She was trying to decode it. Her equations weren't blueprints for control. They were maps for escape. Instructions on how to step outside the feedback loop of human thought. Each of her circles represented a different layer of silence. Physical, mental, spiritual, collective. When overlaid, they formed a doorway, one the early scientists mistook for a containment field. But it wasn't meant to contain energy. It was meant to quiet it, to return the mind to the frequency where thought and self separate. That's what terrified them, because silence, true silence, is dangerous to control systems. It kills addiction. It resets attention. It dissolves fear. And most importantly, it allows a man to see the pattern from outside of it. The architects knew this. That's why, after 1910, any research into acoustic voids, neural harmonics, or zero-point resonance was absorbed into defense departments or buried under corporate patents. Silence became the one forbidden state, the unprofitable emotion. But fragments of her knowledge survived, hidden in monastic chants, encoded in sacred geometry, even whispered through early electronic music, where sound engineers unconsciously recreated the same waveforms Isabel drew on asylum sheets a century before. Every generation, a few people rediscover it, the frequency between frequencies. They describe it as stillness, clarity, or awakening. But what they're really touching is her original signal, the one they spent a century distorting into noise. And if you've ever felt that brief, almost sacred pause, when your mind goes completely quiet and something ancient stirs behind your eyes, that's her. That's Isabel's first language calling you back. Because before control, before corruption, before the hum, there was only silence. And in silence, there was freedom. It started quietly, as all rebellions do, not with noise, but with stillness. By the early 1990s, a few inside the machine began to feel it, a vibration beneath the hum, like a heartbeat out of rhythm. Engineers who'd spent decades building the attention systems suddenly found themselves haunted by fragments of Isabel's pattern. They saw her symbols in the static of their monitors, in the layout of circuit boards, even in their dreams. One of them, Dr. Nathan Kell, a cognitive systems architect at Bell Labs, wrote, "The more I study human-computer synchronization, the more I realize we are the machine's reflection, not its master." He wasn't wrong, but unlike others, he didn't run. He listened. Kell began to collect what he called resonant anomalies, moments where people spontaneously disconnected from a hum and experienced an unexplainable clarity, as though they'd stepped outside time itself. Each event corresponded to brain frequencies dropping below the measurable limit of thought, near complete neural silence. He called it the reversal. The concept was simple. If attention fed the engine, silence could start it. Not rebellion through resistance, but through non-participation. The ultimate act of defiance, stillness. But this wasn't meditation. It was mechanical warfare. Kell's equations used feedback loops against themselves, turning the attention systems inward until they collapsed into quiet. In his private notes, he wrote, "When the watcher watches itself, the loop dies." He built a prototype, a device designed not to broadcast, but to absorb signal. It created a localized field of perfect quiet. No electromagnetic residue, no perceptible hum. And when he activated it, every nearby monitor flickered. Every light dimmed. Then, for 3 full seconds, the entire grid went silent. The world didn't end. But something changed. Inside that silence, he heard a voice. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. "You finally remembered me." Kell disappeared days later. His office scrubbed clean. His files encrypted with a cipher no one could break, except for one recovered fragment. A single phrase embedded in binary. Silence is the reset code. That was the day the reversal became more than theory. It became a contagion. A whisper of freedom hiding in the very system built to enslave it. And for the first time in a century, Isabel's equation began to turn against its masters. It began in 1997. An internal report from a defense-linked tech firm flagged a pattern of mass disengagement. Men across multiple nations, engineers, soldiers, analysts, were walking away from their terminals mid-shift, staring into nothing, sometimes smiling faintly before removing their ID tags and vanishing. They weren't quitting. They were disconnecting. The files describe it clinically: cognitive desync, psychosocial drift, null attention anomalies. But off record, one handler said it bluntly, they've gone quiet. The reversal had begun to spread through silence itself. Every algorithm, every feed, every screen depends on one thing: participation. But these men had stopped feeding it. They found the gap Isabel had left behind, the pause between signal and reaction, and stepped into it. And once they did, the system couldn't reach them. That's when the containment protocol started. Phase 1, stimulation flood. An explosion of content, alerts, breaking news, flashing lights. An artificial storm of noise to drown out stillness. Phase 2, emotional disruption. Fear cycles, outrage, manufacture division. If the mind can't rest, it can't remember itself. Phase 3, isolation. Those who spoke about the hum, who warned others, were branded unstable, conspiratorial, unwell. Their reputations erased, their networks collapsed, their silence weaponized against them. But what the system didn't anticipate was resonance. Each man who found the gap taught another, not with words, but through presence. Stillness became contagious. Silence began to travel like an unseen current, invisible to algorithms, yet deeply felt. The architects called it a containment breach. The awakened called it homecoming. In archived footage from a military lab, a technician whispers off camera, "We can't locate the source anymore. It's not in the wires, it's in the people." The hum was losing grip, and for the first time in generations, the machine trembled. Because the one thing it could not quantify, replicate, or control was now multiplying in the human spirit. Quiet defiance. The reports end abruptly in March 1998. One final line, redacted everywhere, but the physical file survived. If silence continues to spread, the structure of control will collapse within 3 generations. 3 generations. We are the third. By the time the constable returned the next morning, the air itself seemed reluctant to enter the orphanage. Dust floated through the broken windows like ash after a fire. The children sat in silence, their small eyes hollow. In the chapel, where Sister Miriam once prayed, the single candle before the Virgin still burned, though no one had lit it for days. The constable approached it, trembling. He reached to snuff it out, but before his fingers could touch the flame, the wax shifted. It wasn't melting down, it was growing up, as if the candle was feeding on the air, stretching higher with each breath of the room. He stumbled back. His boot struck something, a rosary. Beads blackened, melted together. When he lifted it, a thread of smoke rose from his hand, and the crucifix clung to his skin as though magnetized to flesh. That night, he wrote his report by lantern light. No signs of foul play. Only the air feels wrong. The walls seem to breathe. But in the margin, in handwriting not his own, another line appeared later, when the ink had already dried. The candle still burns. And indeed it did. The villagers who passed the orphanage after nightfall swore they could see its flickering light in the window. Steady, patient, unyielding. Some said it wasn't a candle at all anymore. They said it was her soul, refusing to rest. 2 weeks after the last sighting of light in the chapel, the diocese sent a man named Father Henrik, an archivist known for his quiet obsession with forbidden liturgies, the kind the church no longer admitted existed. He arrived with gloves, notebooks, and a phonograph case wrapped in linen. Inside the orphanage, every sound seemed to collapse under its own weight. The floorboards groaned like something remembering pain. When he entered Sister Miriam's quarters, the air smelled faintly of burnt oil and lavender. Her journal was open to a page halfway through. On the desk, beside her rosary, lay 7 small wax cylinders, each carefully labeled with a date and name. The handwriting was that of a child. He placed one on the phonograph. The wax was warped, cracked, almost translucent in places. The cylinder spun, The room filled with a low, scraping hiss, like a breath trying to form words from the dust. Then a voice, small, trembling, a child's whisper. "Father Henrik, we've been waiting for you." He froze. The name had not yet been mentioned. He had told no one he was coming. The whisper turned into soft laughter, the kind that used to echo through the orphanage halls before the fire, before the silence. "She said you'd come to finish her prayer." The phonograph slowed on its own. The wax cylinder trembled. A thin trickle of melted wax began to slide down its side, as if the voice itself was burning through it. Henrik leaned closer. Beneath the child's laughter, he could hear something else. Dozens of overlapping voices, some sobbing, some chanting in Latin, backwards. When the recording stopped, he lifted the needle. His glove was black with soot. But when he looked at the cylinder again, the title had changed. It no longer read a child's name. It read, "Father Henrik, recorded." The first report came from Maid, one of the last remaining staff who hadn't fled. She said that after the fire, the orphans' faces stopped appearing in photographs, but started appearing in mirrors. She swore she'd seen them standing behind her while she scrubbed the chapel floors. Faces pale, eyes wide, mouths stitched with ash. But when she turned, the room was empty. Only the reflection moved, mouthing words she couldn't hear. Then, one night, Father Henrik found a mirror. It stood cracked at the edges, framed in black iron, left in the East Wing's ruined hallway, the only object untouched by the flames. On its surface, dust had settled in the shape of fingerprints, small ones. He lit a candle, its flame trembling against the glass. At first, it showed only him, but then another figure began to fade into view behind his reflection. A small girl in a soot-stained dress, holding a rosary that swung without sound. "Why did you leave us, Father?" The voice came from the glass. Henrik stumbled back, clutching the crucifix around his neck. His reflection remained perfectly still, even as he moved. The girl's head tilted slightly, and suddenly, the mirror fogged from the inside. Written across the condensation were the words, "Your reflection isn't yours anymore." He stared as his mirrored self began to smirk, a movement he hadn't made. It leaned closer, pressing its hand against the glass. The surface rippled like water, and then the reflection whispered something he would later write down, but never speak aloud. A prayer in a language that predated Latin, the same one found in the Codex Miriam had studied before her death. That night, the mirror was removed from the orphanage and locked inside the diocesan vault. But a week later, a janitor cleaning the vault reported that the glass had changed again. Now, instead of Henrik or the girl, it showed every orphan's face at once, staring outward, silent, waiting. And at the very bottom of the mirror frame, carved deep into the iron, someone had etched a new name, not in Latin, not in English, but unmistakably readable. "Yours." No one ever spoke of the bells anymore. The tower had been sealed since the night of the fire. 6 bells remained, blackened, warped, silent. But there had always been 7. Father Henrik discovered that detail buried in a forgotten ledger, 7 bells forged. 6 retrieved, 1 unaccounted. It seemed like nothing at first. A clerical error, a lost relic of old metal. Until the children began humming. They hummed a single tone, low, almost inaudible, the same frequency, over and over, as if echoing something ancient that lived beneath sound itself. When Henrik played their recordings in the cathedral's phonograph, something strange happened. The needle vibrated without contact. The air thickened. The candles bent toward the sound like flowers drawn to light. He isolated the tone. It wasn't a note. It was a pattern, a geometric rhythm, like a pulse turned into sound. The seventh bell's resonance, though the bell itself had never been found. Then came the witnesses. One by one, survivors of the orphanage fire described hearing it in their dreams. A deep tolling from somewhere beneath the earth, shaking the floorboards of their sleep. It doesn't ring, one said. It calls. When the diocese questioned Father Henrik about the reports, he denied everything. But in his private journal, a line appeared in handwriting not his own. The bell doesn't wait to be rung. It listens. He tried to burn the page. The flame went out 3 times before catching. And when it finally burned, the sound began again. Faint, distant, yet unmistakable. The 7th bell was ringing. Not from the tower, not from the ruins, but from inside the walls. Deep, rhythmic, patient. And each toll seemed to move closer. When Henrik awoke the next morning, the phonograph was still spinning, though the cylinder had long since stopped. Inside its horn, he found something impossible, a small black fragment of iron shaped like a bell's clapper. It was warm to the touch. He lifted it to his ear, and in the silence between his own heartbeats, he heard the sound again. Not ringing this time, but breathing. They never recovered the children's bodies. Not one. The fire had devoured the orphanage in less than an hour. Investigators found bones, yes, but none small enough to belong to a child. Only adult remains, scorched and fused to the foundation. It didn't make sense. 37 children vanished, erased without trace. Father Henrik refused to accept the official reports. He spent weeks combing the ruins, pulling up scorched planks and sifting through soot. One night, as the lantern flickered low, he found something strange. A trapdoor beneath the chapel's altar, sealed shut with wax and symbols carved into the wood. He broke the seal. The moment he pried it open, the air rushed upward, cold but alive. It wasn't wind. It was breath. Slow, rhythmic, like something exhaling from the darkness below. He lowered the lantern. A staircase descended into blackness. The walls were carved with strange markings, spirals, hands, and open eyes. And beneath the soot, faint traces of writing in a language older than scripture. At the bottom stood a small chamber lined with stone beds, 37 of them. Each bore a name etched into the wall. Each pillow was still indented, as if the children had only just risen. On the far wall, a mural stretched from floor to ceiling. The orphans kneeling in a circle, heads bowed, surrounding a figure with no face, holding a bell in its hand. Henrik moved closer. The mural's paint shimmered faintly, alive in the lantern light. That's when he saw it. The smallest movement, right where the figure's hand met the bell. The painted fingers twitched, and from deep within the stone, he heard it, the sound of breathing again. Not from one direction, but from all around him. The walls pulsed like lungs. Dust fell from the ceiling in time with the breaths. He dropped the lantern. It shattered. The flame died. But in the darkness, he swore he saw 37 faint outlines rise from the beds. Not bodies, not shadows, impressions. And before he blacked out, he heard a whisper pressed against his ear, a voice not meant for human understanding. "We're still here, Father. We just stopped needing air." When Father Henrik awoke, he was no longer in the chamber. He was lying in the chapel above, the air thick with smoke, his throat raw with ash. The trapdoor was sealed again, as though it had never been opened. But on the altar, there was something new, a single sheet of parchment, still warm to the touch. The ink shimmered, moving slightly as if alive. A hymn, handwritten in neat staves of musical notation. No signature, no source. The melody looked simple at first glance. 8 bars, soft and unassuming. But when Henrik began to play it on the organ, the air inside the chapel changed. Dust froze midair. The light from the candles bent backward. He pressed another key, and the room breathed. Each note seemed to echo not in sound, but in space itself, like the walls were remembering the children's voices. As the final chord lingered, he realized the melody contained a pattern, a message encrypted in tone intervals. He decoded it by hand, marking each rise and fall with letters. The result formed a single line in Latin. Ad bellum septimum resurge. Rise to the 7th bell. Henrik's pulse quickened. The 7th bell again, the one that was never found. He played to him a second time, slower, trembling. This time, a faint chorus joined him. The same children's voices from the wax recordings, harmonizing perfectly. But one voice rose above the rest, clear, mournful, unmistakably human. We wrote this for you. He stopped playing, but the music continued. The keys moved on their own. The organ's pipes breathed without air. And from the walls, faint outlines of hands began to press through the plaster. Small, reaching, pleading. He fled the chapel, but the melody followed. The next morning, the parish choir reported that their hymnals had changed overnight. Every page rewritten with that same music. Identical handwriting, identical ink, identical message. When the diocese burned the hymnals weeks later, witnesses claimed the flames hissed in rhythm. The same haunting 8-bar melody. And deep beneath the ashes, the fire left a shape behind. 7 circles linked in a ring. The mark of the bell that still hadn't rung. They came without warning. 3 men, dressed in black wool coats, carrying no insignias, no holy symbols. Only a small leather case sealed with red wax. They said they were from Rome, but not from any known office, not from the Vatican's registry, not from the diocese's chain of command. Their letter of authority bore no signature, only the imprint of 7 overlapping rings, pressed deep into the parchment like a burn. Father Henrik felt the shift immediately. These were not men of faith. They were men of containment. The leader, tall, gaunt, his eyes pale as glass, introduced himself simply as Archivist number 7. He asked no questions about the orphanage. He asked only to see where the sound came from. Henrik hesitated. The man repeated himself. The temperature dropped. Even the candle flames bent away from him. They moved through the ruins in silence. When they reached the sealed trapdoor beneath the altar, the archivist placed his hand upon it and whispered, not in prayer, but in something older. The wax seal melted without heat. Beneath, the darkness sighed. They descended together. The air was heavy, damp, pulsing. The archivist knelt before the mural Henrik had described, the one where the painted fingers had moved and smiled faintly. They finished it, he said, the 7th choir. Henrik asked what that meant. The man ignored him. He pulled a tuning fork from his coat, struck it once against the stone, and the walls answered. The tone spread through the chamber like blood and water. The mural began to glow. The painted children lifted their heads, eyes open now. The archivist watched without fear. They've learned to cross sound, he murmured, to turn resonance into passage. He closed the leather case, stood, and looked directly at Henrik. "You shouldn't have opened the door, Father. You made them remember." Then he handed Henrik a single item from his coat pocket, a small iron tag engraved with the number 7, and walked into the mural's light. When the glow faded, they were gone. All 3 men. Only the echo of their footsteps remained, and the faint, distant toll of a bell that had never existed in any church record. After the men from Rome vanished, the church went quiet. Too quiet. Within weeks, the orphanage's name was erased from diocesan records. Funding logs were purged. Every mention of Sister Miriam, the orphans, and Father Henrik disappeared from public archives as if they had never lived. But one record survived, hidden in a crate bound for incineration, sealed under the title Directive, Silentia. It wasn't a report. It was an instruction, a manual written in 12 parts, stamped with that same insignia. 7 rings, each slightly misaligned, forming a vortex when viewed from above. The document's first page was chillingly direct. No sound above 32 hertz is to be permitted near Site 7. Auditory stimuli may induce emergence. If exposure occurs, silence the witness. Henrik read those words again and again. Site 7. That was the number on the archivist tag, the same one now hanging from his neck. The following pages described resonance containment methods, but not for machines. For voices, it detailed how certain tonal patterns could open acoustic apertures through which entities of non-human frequency could pass. He realized then what the orphanage had become. Not a home, not a sanctuary, but an instrument, a place designed to channel sound into something else. And the orphans, their hymns, their synchronized breathing, had been part of the tuning. They weren't victims. They were the choir. One line near the end of the directive stood out, scrawled in ink darker than the rest. The 7th bell will not ring again if silence is preserved. That single word, again, burned into him. It meant it had happened before. Somewhere else. Some other century. Some other failed silence. Henrik tried to report it. He sent letters to Rome, to the archdiocese, even to local authorities. None returned. But 3 days later, a man in a gray cassock came to his door. He said nothing. He only placed a sealed envelope in Henrik's hand and left. Inside was a single scrap of paper. No lettereath, no salutation. Only 5 words, written in a child's handwriting. You broke the silence, Father. The letter arrived in the dead of night. No return address. No unsee. Only that single childlike scrawl. You broke the silence, Father. Henrik didn't sleep after that. He sat in his small quarters, staring at the iron tag marked 7, turning it over and over until the edges cut his palm. At precisely 3:07 a.m., the floorboards trembled, softly, like something exhaling through the earth. The same breath he'd heard beneath the chapel. Only now, it came from everywhere. The walls, the window, the crucifix above his bed. He rose slowly. In the hallway, the air shimmered like heat, though it was cold enough to see his breath. He followed the sound, the faint hum that had once filled the orphanage halls when the children prayed. It was returning. He stepped into the chapel. The altar stood exactly as before, untouched since the investigation. But the wax seals on the trapdoor had melted again. This time, there were fingerprints in the wax. Small ones,